Hello and welcome to the Ecocide and International Crimes Against Nature webinar with Raven and Stop Ecocide International. My name is Anna Simeon. I'm Raven's campaigns director. And I would just like to welcome everybody. I understand we have people from, of course, all over Turtle Island, which we are used to, but also from Fiji to Siberia and everywhere in between. So it's absolutely amazing to be in the same circle with such a diverse crowd. A few housekeeping details. You will see in the right-hand corner of your screen that you have a toggle between gallery view and speaker view. So when the people are having a lively debate that goes like a tennis ball back and forth, you might want to have gallery view. And when one speaker is kind of going in depth, you might toggle it to speaker view so you can see their face a bit better. We will be also taking questions at the end of the webinar. So please put them in the chat and address them to everyone. And I will be then picking, obviously we won't be able to do all the questions, but we'll have at least 2 or 3. We are also recording this webinar and the recording will be available and we will send it by email at the end. So right now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Nicholls, the chair of the Ravens board. Jeff is a member of the Raven clan, as it happens, of the Tsimshian Nation, and a graduate of the University of Victoria Law School, a staff lawyer with Radcliffe Law Company in Vancouver. Jeff has worked with the Indigenous Law Research Unit to articulate Tsimshian laws, which he sees as inextricably linked to the territory and the ancestral homeland where he comes from in northwestern BC. So developing a lifelong connection to that land and waters is his lifelong passion and pursuit. So without further ado, over to Jeff.
Hi, I was going to say good afternoon, everyone, but I want to acknowledge that people are joining us, in fact, from around the world. So wishing well to everyone that's joining us. I'd like to, first and foremost, I'm joining the webinar from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, but I also want to recognize that in today's world, we're being joined from all sorts of different places. So I just want to take a moment to invite everyone who's joined to reflect on whose territory you join today's webinar from, wherever that may be. I'm so happy to be joined today by an esteemed panel who's going to be talking about ecocide and environmental justice and some other fascinating thoughts. I'm really excited to learn more about this topic. I'll take a moment to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to invite Jojo in particular to start us off the discussion with an overview of the topic, and then I'll invite Robert and Leah to provide some initial reflections, and then I hope to just let the conversation flow from there. I might have some questions, and the panelists might have some questions for each other. And then at the end, we'll hope to take some questions from the participants. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing our esteemed panel. And I especially offer gratitude from Raven for their participation. Raven as an organization is, we're all about Indigenous rights and environmental justice. And so, we know we share that mission today, and the discussion is really related to that. So I'm really pleased to begin. So we have Robert Morales, and Robert Morales is Coast Salish from Cowichan tribes. He has an extensive law practice specializing in Indigenous human rights law, Aboriginal rights law, and First Nations policy development. Robert is the chief negotiator for the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group, which represents 5 Vancouver Island First Nations in treaty negotiations. He is also the lead for the current Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group petition before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights concerning the removal of ancestral lands from the Hul'qumi'num control. Robert also served and is currently serving as the chair for the Somewhat Chief Negotiators, the organization under which the First Nations in British Columbia, Canada, are organized to engage in the treaty process. We also have Leah Gazan. and she is a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota First Nation in Saskatchewan, and has Asian and Jewish roots. Leah previously taught at the University of Winnipeg prior to running in the 2019 election and winning the Winnipeg Centre seat for the NDP, which is a federal riding. Leah represented the province of Manitoba for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, advocating for the acknowledgement of injustice perpetuated against Indigenous adoptive children. And she is one among a number of federal MPs from several political parties who have expressed support for the Ecocide initiative. And I'd just like to take a moment to note that, although Leah is an elected politician in Canada, at least for a federal party, that the broader initiative is a nonpartisan initiative, and she's just here to contribute on her behalf, and she can speak more about that later. And we also have Jojo Mehta. Jojo is the co-founder of the Stop Ecocide campaign in 2017, alongside barrister and legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins. It was founded to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. Jojo is the chair of the board for the Stop Ecocide Foundation in the Netherlands, which now manages the campaign, and convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide, chaired by Philippe Sands, QC, and Justice Florence Mumba. She was a keynote speaker at the official side event, Investigating and Prosecuting Ecocide, the Current and Future Role of the ICC, in December of 2019. And that was hosted by the Republic of Vanuatu as part of the 18th Assembly of State Parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. I also note that Merle Alexander was scheduled to join us today, but due to other scheduling conflicts, he unfortunately had to attend to those, and he sends his regrets. So with that, Jojo, would you like to take a few moments to just explain some of your work and what Ecocide is all about?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's an honor and privilege to be part of this panel. And thank you to such a wide audience for responding to this discussion tonight, or today, depending on where you are in the world. So the Stop Ecocide campaign, which is an international campaign founded in 2017, as Jeff mentioned, exists for a sole purpose, and that is to make it a crime to destroy the earth, to destroy ecosystems. There's a very simple reason for this. It makes absolutely no sense to destroy the systems of which we are a fundamental part, and without which there would be no life on this planet, and there certainly would be no human life. And the word ecocide itself sums that up if you look at its etymology. So eco comes from the Greek oikos, which means home, and side comes from the Latin cedere, to kill. So ecocide is literally to kill one's home. And the earth is, of course, our only home. Now, serious destruction of ecosystems is rapidly becoming the greatest threat to the balance of life on this planet, and ultimately will become the greatest threat to humanity itself. And the Stop Ecocide Foundation's work finds itself at the interface of addressing this issue of making destruction of ecosystems a crime, of addressing this issue both on the legal and diplomatic side, but also on the side of the public narrative. So our work evolves very much at the interface between those three points. We particularly campaign for this to become a crime at the international level, at the ICC, because it's the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of all its member states, which means that if you criminalize something at the International Criminal Court, any country that ratifies it must also enforce in its own domestic legislation within a year. And so it creates a kind of coherence across borders, which is very important in this arena, given that the most serious perpetrators of harm to ecosystems are large transnational corporations, which have the capability to move between jurisdictions if they wish to. And so to create a coherence across borders, we believe the most efficient way to do this is to create an international law, which must then be echoed in domestic legislation. And it's a way of saying that beyond a certain level of destruction, you cannot go. And taking that into the criminal arena has a particular effect compared to environmental regulation. It creates personal responsibility, and that is an enforceable deterrent in a way that fines, for example, are simply failing to be in the civil law arena. But ecocide law is also the acknowledgement of a reality, which is that we are part of a larger web of life. And that is something that Indigenous cultures have always known, and indeed have been trying to tell the rest of the world for a rather long time. Now, the mindset of the dominant kind of Western system is itself a mindset of dominance, of dualism. And this goes back centuries. You know, you can trace it right back to Plato and possibly beyond, in terms of a kind of contrast between, you know, the ideal and the real, that segues right into the kind of Catholic Church domination of spirit and body, and, you know, religion and nature and the physical as being opposed to each other. And then that moves straight on into the Enlightenment thinking, where reason is opposed to nature and to the emotions. And so there's a very strong dualism that runs for centuries and centuries through Western thinking, and that creates a way of being that's kind of in its own image. So a dominant thinking creates a dominating system. And that is what we suffer from on a global scale now. And so we also see ecocide law as potentially a way of redressing that balance, of changing that emphasis. Because when we consider destruction of nature on a par with destruction of human beings, we start to equalize that balance. We start to realize that in fact what we need is not harm but harmony. And so there's a way in which this law, in other words, criminalizing harm to nature, echoes a very fundamental law, which almost a universal law, one could say, which is the law of reciprocity. If you damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. That's not something we decide at a societal level. That is something that is simply a fact. And it's becoming an ever more obvious fact in the increasingly apocalyptic nature of the destruction that we're seeing across the world. And so in this context, the Stop Ecocide campaign and this law itself has a kind of reflection that, you know, we feel with the Indigenous perspective, in the sense of we've been in conversation, strong conversation with Indigenous networks over the last few months, precisely in this context. And, you know, key among these networks is the Mother Earth delegation of United Original Nations, which is a network of Indigenous elders across the world, bringing the voices of original peoples into our work. And not least in terms of the legal drafting panel that Jeff mentioned. We have convened in response to a request from parliamentarians from the governing parties in Sweden. We have convened an international panel of top criminal lawyers to draft a legal definition of ecocide that could potentially actually be proposed at the International Criminal Court by interested states. Now, while there have been working definitions over the years, this is the first time that it's been directly in the context of interest at a governmental level to potentially taking this forward. And on that panel, one of the members of that panel is Pablo Fajardo, a well-known lawyer from Ecuador, who championed the voices of Indigenous local communities in Ecuador against the oil giant Chevron for decades. And he is bringing specifically that voice into the panel. Also, in consultation with the Mother Earth delegation, we are convening an advisory circle of Indigenous elders from each of the different continents to advise in as a backdrop to that drafting panel, along with other sectors of society, so that there is direct input into the conception and the textual realization of a potential law of ecocide. So this is very exciting, and this is in progress right now. And perhaps, I mean, I find this an amazing honor, actually, and it's my delight to be able to let this audience know, as the first people to know this, in fact, which is that we recently had the first convening of the drafting panel. And during that session, the Mother Earth delegation of United Original Nations held ceremony during the same period of time that that drafting panel was convening. And so that felt like an extraordinary blessing and endorsement of the work that has been going on and will be going on over the next few months as this definition crystallizes. Now, I'm not an expert on the situation in Canada, but I'm deeply aware that there's a tangled web of treaties and mistreatments which make social and land rights issues key among Indigenous concerns in Canada. And I'm very interested to hear how Leah Gazan and Robert Morales will conceive of and interpret the work that we're doing in the context of their knowledge in that arena. And I'm also aware that Western law itself can be problematic from the context of original nations' voices. However, unless I'm much mistaken, it is also Western corporations with Western mindsets which are the ones wreaking destruction. And therefore, I suppose our starting premise might be that if Western law can create an enforceable deterrent to those Western operators, it could be perhaps a useful tool for those protecting threatened lands and territories. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Jojo, for that very useful overview of the law of ecocide. And it's very clear that a lot of work has gone into this initiative, and I really appreciate hearing that that story about the process of the elders holding ceremony, because that really resonates personally with me, because the process is in my view probably just as important as any particular outcome, and it's just really cool to hear about that. So I'm going to invite bring in the other panelists on this. Perhaps Leah, would you like to just say a few words and process, in the words of Jojo, process and interpret perhaps your own perspectives on this particular topic, and share whatever thoughts you'd like.
Okay. Bonjour, Heyushka Washtewi, Red Sky Woman, Indigenous, Makwa Dodem, Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, Treaty 4 Territory, Saskatchewan, and I'm coming here today from Treaty 1 Territory, homeland of the Métis Nation, from my riding known as Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I was sharing, and since we have people from around the globe, I do have bragging rights to say that it is currently minus 20 degrees Celsius here, with a wind chill, which makes it minus 27. So I feel that that gives me some sort of clout to be surviving today in that kind of weather. In any case, I didn't go outside, but no, I want to just say how honored I am to be here today. Certainly with my panelists and or respected panelists, and to all of you here today. It's really inspiring to see so many people from around the world coming together to protect our Mother Earth. And as you were speaking, Jojo, in how I look at it, it's very much like a relationship, the relationship we have with our mother. And this relationship has been a very violent relationship. The most grotesque violence that's being perpetrated against our Mother Earth. The same kind of violence that's being perpetrated against Indigenous women and girls in this country, which is heightened around resource extraction projects through oil and gas, for example, mining, that wreak havoc on our women and girls and bring violence into our community. The same kind of violence that we see being perpetrated against our Mother Earth. And it's the same kind of violence. It's the same from, colonial violence that has been perpetrated against Indigenous people in this place we now call Canada, a country that was built on the wrongful dispossession of land of Indigenous peoples through violent acts of land dispossession that continue on today against the free, prior, and informed consent, very often, of Indigenous peoples. And there's many examples that we've witnessed in real time in Canada, this kind of neo-colonial violence. Wet'suwet'en territory, for example, in BC, the traditional territories, without the free, prior, and informed consent of the traditional leadership there, LNG. What happened in Mi'kma'ki territory against people that were exercising their inherent right to fish, violence, burnings of their fishery buildings, TMX pipeline, Sweatmec peoples, Manitoba Hydro, and the kind of impoverishment that has come as a result in the province where I reside, as a result of aggressive hydro development. Supported in Canada through often militarized police, who was leaked about a year ago, were given permission to use snipers against people defending their lands. So there's a growing tension. Canada, it's important to know that they're out of the over 150 countries in the world that has recognized a clean, healthy, and safe environment as a human right, Canada still does not. And on the backs of this environmental destruction, it's on the backs of Indigenous peoples who are on the front lines of climate change. Now at a point where there are on Turtle Island communities that are going underwater. And I think, I appreciated your comments, and to know that you were talking about Western's understandings of that relationship where humans are on the top. I remember learning that in school. Humans were at the top and then it went down from there. But here's the thing. There is no life without water. We cannot survive. Mother Earth doesn't need us. We need Mother Earth. And so it's critical. We're at a critical juncture. We are at a breaking point that we redefine that relationship. So it's a relationship of nonviolence. And I would argue the kind of resource extraction that's happening currently in Canada and around the globe on the backs of Indigenous peoples throughout the world needs to change. And it needs to be rooted in human rights, the kind of human rights articulated in the United Nations definition or Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I'll leave it there. I'm a recovering academic. I can talk for 30 years. Just throw me off the mic. But that's my reflection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. I'd like to just read a comment from the audience that somebody typed while you were speaking. It's a lady named Kia from Aotearoa, New Zealand, who was agreeing with you. She said, that's correct. It's Western ideologies and companies that are destroying our planet. So now it's time for them to answer for some outstanding injustices and step aside.
Great.
Thank you very much, Leah, for your opening remarks. I particularly appreciate you recognizing the link between environmental degradation and violence towards Indigenous women. For those of you that might not be aware, the issue of violence against Indigenous women is endemic in Canada. Recently, there was an inquiry into this issue. I might get lost in the chat, but I did place a link to the final report of that inquiry. It's quite lengthy, but it does in some ways touch on that very important issue. Robert, would you like to provide some opening remarks and reflections?
Hi, Squale. Good day. Friends and relatives. Entha Thalfit. My traditional name is Thalfit. Danitsanat Quatson. I come from the First Nation in British Columbia, the Cowichan tribes. Y mi padre fue de Mexico, and my father was from Mexico. So I have Indigenous relatives in Canada and Indigenous relatives in Mexico and in Latin America. Honored to be able to speak to all of you. I've been watching the chats and impressed to see the number of participants from various countries and within Canada, various First Nations and other representatives. As Jeff has indicated, I am a lawyer by occupation. I am a chief negotiator for our nations here on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. And we are in the process of negotiating a modern treaty, a modern constitutional relationship with the government of Canada and the government of British Columbia. And a long history of I guess, oppression that we're been trying to reconcile. We entered this modern treaty process in '97. So it's been over 20 years that we've been trying to come to an agreement with the governments in terms of the rights of Indigenous peoples in this part of the world. I've given many presentations in the past about the colonial heritage that Indigenous peoples have suffered for since contact. You know, the doctrines that European nations adopted as they colonized the Americas, doctrines such as the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of terra nullius, which really said that Indigenous peoples were in fact not human, number one. And because they were not human, they really didn't have any rights to land, any rights to make decisions about resources, any rights to any kind of benefit from the lands, any rights to make any decisions with regard to the land. And so through these legal doctrines, they were able to strip Indigenous peoples from the Americas of all of those rights, and to assert that their European system of laws trumped Indigenous laws, that their European system of laws really were the only laws that were applicable. And so because of those legal doctrines, it led to the destruction of Indigenous peoples' cultures here in the Americas. And through, you know, I guess the conquering of nations in terms of some cases, you know, through wars, and in some cases through disease, and in some cases simply by asserting that there was this overriding legal position, which is what happened here in British Columbia. We were not conquered through wars. We were badly affected by disease, and our populations were decimated through disease. And the assertion of the English government that in fact their laws were the laws of the land, and the policies of those governments led to Indigenous peoples here in British Columbia going through a very difficult period of time. And it's only recently that we've been able to begin to reassert our position here. In the work that I'm involved in our territory, we have been significantly affected by, in particular, extraction of resources. Very early in the history of this province and in the history of our territory, corporations were really, multinational corporations were really the beneficiaries of the resources, and large scale extraction of timber, of minerals, of fish, of all of the resources that were important to Indigenous peoples occurred. And so now we're in a position where we're trying to find a way to preserve what little is left in order that culturally our communities can continue to exercise those cultural traditions, those ways of life that were important. And we brought a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, asserting that the state of Canada did violate our human rights, that they, in fact, in our particular case, granted away almost our entire territory to a private corporation, to a railway company. And that railway company was sold to another company, which was sold to another corporation. And corporate interests have been the major beneficiaries of the resources of this territory. And so we see, vast areas of land that have been clear cut, that timber has been extracted, and no benefit to the Indigenous peoples at all. And so we brought a petition to the Inter-American Commission. The Inter-American Commission ruled in our favor on admissibility, but our case has been held up in that process, and so we don't have a final decision. It's been languishing in the Inter-American Commission system for several years now. And that's one of the challenges that we have with international law. When I went to law school, international law was not one of those strong areas of law that were, considered. And so to raise the bar on this issue, to bring it to the International Court of Justice, if that's where this is going, and make it an offense that is recognized by countries, I think would be a major step forward. Right now, Canada, although they profess to be strong supporters of human rights, have not been strong supporters of Indigenous human rights. And I suspect that it's in part because of the very serious implications of political position and wealth. The resources that are there in the land are a major motivator for countries like Canada to retain control. And so, as a result, Canada has not signed on to international treaties like the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man. They choose which international instruments they will support and the level to which they will support them. As Leah has indicated, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Canada was one of the objectors. And, along with the United States and Australia, and New Zealand, I think it was Kansas, I think they called it, the four nations that objected and voted to not support. And so, now that Canada has signed on and said we fully support it, I have seen very little evidence that they are actually on the ground prepared to implement. And so it's one thing to politically support these indigenous or these international instruments, but it's another thing to actually implement them. And I would be interested, in terms of other countries' experiences for Indigenous peoples, where there are rights that are recognized, human rights that are recognized, and the relationship between humans and the environment is one that are culturally is very strong. Our names are in relation to where we come from, where we are on this earth. Many of the teachings of our communities and of our culture has to do with nature and has to do with our relationship with the earth. And so these are important issues that are being discussed. A very, very interesting approach to see if in fact nations would support this type of an initiative going forward. The experience that we've had is it's very difficult to get nation states like Canada to actually support the implementation of these Indigenous human rights. And I guess, included in that would be rights in relation to the environment. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to make a few comments as we get started. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think we all really respect and appreciate your perspectives on this matter. Just a personal anecdote, I was in my undergrad and I listened to a talk that you gave on, it was particularly your complaint to the Inter-American Commission, and I learned so much about international law and how it applies to Indigenous peoples, and those teachings I still carry some to this day. So I can personally attest to the fact that you're an amazing teacher, and your very pragmatic and practical experience, as well as philosophical thinking on these topics is very profound, and we really appreciate hearing your voice in this discussion. One topic that I was really curious about coming into this webinar and just thinking about this concept of ecocide is what would be the, when I think about my primary experience being educated in criminal law comes from the Canadian context. I was educated in Canadian law, and when judges and when politicians they write criminal law and judges apply the law, they actually articulate certain principles or values to consider, either when crafting an actual crime or in crafting a sentence or a remedy to that crime. And these are very interesting things to actually pick apart. So, for example, I think about, Leah, what you mentioned about a relationship to the land and relationship to each other. There's specific values and principles that are within that relationship, and perhaps a breach of those could be the crime, or it could be the offense. And then when I heard you speaking, I heard a lot about implications and remedies, and what. And I'm really curious about, and perhaps Jojo, you can elaborate on this from your experience in actually, theorizing ecocide. What does the remedy look like? And then I also invite the panelists to kind of speak a bit more about, what are the kinds of values that we would want considered in crafting a sentence? Like, what does a remedy look like in this particular context?
So sorry. I just wanted to, so just as a legislator currently, one of the things that makes things difficult is that we are inconsistent in our honoring of human rights, including commitments we've made domestically and with the international community. And that's what actually complicates matters. I just wanted to comment on Mr. Morales' comments before about, even in British Columbia, they've implemented the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But, they don't always honor that. I mean, we see that in real time. That is absolutely a valid and true. That doesn't mean that you don't want to put these things into law, but then it's on the onus of people that are in these positions to uphold the law, not only when it suits our economic and political interests. And that is currently what happens in situations. In terms of my personal perspective, when we talk about relationship as punitive, that to me is not a relationship. Certainly, upholding human rights, including the right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment, which means that nurturing human rights, but nurturing a relationship that respects human rights, so that, for example, oil companies can't go into territories, destroy lands, and not have to clean it up. And certainly consequences to that. But here's the thing. I think we are at a critical juncture. We are not at a point where we can keep buying into the fossil fuel industries that are destroying our mother. And we need to move towards a green economy that brings workers along, that protects workers within a framework that upholds the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, with also consultation with civil society groups. I think rather than talking about punishment, we need to look at new ways forward. And although not a partisan event, I put a bill forward to recognize a clean, healthy, and safe environment as a human right, Bill C-232, within the framework of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in consultation with civil society groups to uphold our commitments we've made to the international community. The fact that in Canada right now, people are literally on the front lines of resistance, protecting their rights to free, prior, and informed consent. But just wanted to read this. Also, Article 25 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which states this: Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities. Meaning us, to future generation in this regard. How are you supposed to do that in Beaver Lake Cree Nation, who Ravens Trust has done a lot of work with, where they're fighting a precedent-setting case about the impact that the tar sands has had on their traditional rights to hunt and fish, or just to be in their lands? And so, I think it's wonderful that we're looking at a definition, but again, that needs to be led by Indigenous peoples who are on the front lines of these issues. We are in Canada; these are Indigenous lands, and Indigenous people's rights need to be lifted up and respected in this discussion, particularly because we are the ones that are being the most impacted by this aggressive resource extraction that has occurred in Canada.
Jeff, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
As well. Yeah, I practiced criminal law for many years. And I guess the first step, I suspect, would be to create the offense. But what would the criteria be for an action to be characterized as an offense? Is it going to be based on some criteria about the impact on the earth, or is it going to be, about the impact on peoples, including indigenous peoples, but, broader societal sort of issues? So I see that would be the first challenge. How do you create an offense? And then with regard to remedies, I suspect that there are remedies that could be crafted. In our territory, I see, some kind of a remedy in terms of corporations having to disgorge sort of all of their profits, right? It's a penalty, right? It's a monetary penalty. These decisions that corporations are making are based on one issue and one issue only, and that is the bottom line. How much money is this going to make for us? In our territory, we have 3 major corporations that privately own 85% of the traditional territory that our nations have previously occupied. And those 3 corporations are all owned by insurance companies. And one of those corporations recently sold to the pension funds for the Canadian and British Columbian public servants. So, these are not decisions that are being made to support community. These are not decisions that are being made to support, these higher values. These are decisions that are being made probably to support shareholders, right? And to, just to increase the bottom line for shareholders. And so, what is it that is most important to them? It is that bottom line. So if there is a possibility that they have to disgorge that they have to pay back, I'm sure that will be a deterrent. And then I suspect before that, limits and stronger mechanisms for, what here in Canada and what other I know countries have implemented was around, making plans, the consultation and accommodation process. What kind of guarantees or what kind of predetermined safeguards will be put into place before a corporation is permitted to move forward. And we see this playing out right now. Tomorrow we're going to see it play out tomorrow. If President-elect Biden signs this bill to kill the Keystone pipeline, you see it in action right there. I mean, it's about this stopping this activity before it gets started. But you also see the pushback coming from Canada in terms of saying, well, if the United States does this, then we're going to bring legal action against them. So I think that crafting, number one, crafting the offense, and as you say, crafting the penalty will be an important piece of this. I think that there will be significant resistance to trying to criminalize these activities, because this is the backbone of corporations, and corporations really have a major influence on public policy. Thanks.
Jojo, did you want to provide a bit more context on this?
Yeah, there were a few points that were raised there by both Roberta and Leah. And yeah, I'd like to come back on a few things with what I hope will be some helpful points. I think Robert Morales was absolutely right when he talks about corporations looking to the bottom line. But let's remember that corporations can only look to the bottom line within what's criminally legal. So you can't go to a government and ask for a permit to kill a few hundred people, but you can go to a government and ask for a permit to drill for oil. So effectively, by adding ecocide to the criminal sphere, you're creating a new condition against that bottom line. And so that is something that's actually quite important in terms of, the emphasis on criminal law. And in regards to restoration and remedy, that's obviously something that will be discussed further down the line in terms of the development of this law. But certainly I know that Polly Higgins, who I worked with for many years before her death, was always very focused on the fact that sentencing should include restorative justice of some kind. And that should be very much a part of, how this pans out. And also I note that one of the key things that brought Polly into this whole arena was flying over the tar sands in Canada. So there was a real impetus there from the very beginning in relation to Canada specifically. In terms of what Leah Gazan was saying about the consultation with the Indigenous, obviously, as I mentioned, we have someone who has very much been on the front line with the Indigenous in the Amazon, who will be directly contributing to this particular drafting. But also, and of course, as I say, we are convening also an advisory circle from around the world. But I would also like to add that we are launching this week a public consultation as well, which will enable anyone or any group to respond to questions around how this law is drafted, and all of those responses will be analysed and distilled for the panel to study. So there is a very strong impetus to democratising as much as possible, to opening as much as possible to as many different inputs as we can, while this panel crafts the definition of ecocide that states can potentially use. And I think I also want to come back on what Leah Gazan was saying around, a punitive relationship isn't a relationship. And I completely appreciate that that's the case, and that what we're needing to move towards is indeed a relationship of harmony with Mother Earth, not of harm, not of violence. But we see ecocide as a crime, as a kind of a bridging piece, if you like, because right now, I don't believe I could go to the head of Chevron, or to the head of Shell, or to the head of Monsanto, or to the head of any of these huge ecocidal corporations, and create in them a change of heart that will change that relationship without a parameter that does that. Now, all of these companies, these big companies, have, for example, they have renewables departments. They're developing different ways of doing things, but they're not doing them because they're not being forced to do them. The bulk of their business is still the old way of doing things. And so there's a way in which a law of ecocide can create a kind of a parameter or a guardrail that is not, currently in place, and which can potentially curb the worst excesses and allow for us to move genuinely towards a more harmonious approach. And I think that we're reaching a point globally of crisis, and of an increasing realization in the public mind of the sort of desperate nature of our situation. As somebody likened the sort of situation that we're in to pushing a coffee cup off a table. While you're just pushing it towards the edge, you're just pushing it towards the edge. At a certain point, it's going to go over that edge. You ain't going to get it back. And that is something that, that kind of concept of being close to the edge of something, in terms of the science that is now emerging around tipping points and feedback loops and so on, is really beginning, I think. And it is sadly still just a beginning, but it is beginning to emerge in the public consciousness. And there are some states where we are starting to see a shift in that approach. And for example, France is a case in point, where they actually are trying to legislate for ecocide, albeit the definition that they've chosen to use for their national legislation, we believe, is rather watered down. It nonetheless shows that there are steps towards this shift in mindset. And this sort of point of crisis, we believe, does create, as crises often do, an opportunity for a shift, potentially even somewhere like Canada, which has, hitherto not necessarily followed through on, the promises that we maybe see it making from the external point of view. And so I do believe that we are at a point where those things are beginning to change. And I think one of the other things that struck me was what Robert Morales was saying about the way that he identifies himself with the land that he comes from. And I think this is something that is particularly important in what the original peoples, the indigenous voices can bring into this, because I believe that in the kind of Western dominant paradigm, we have very much forgotten how to do this, how to have roots, how to relate to the land in, you know, where we are born and where we are rooted. And just speaking from my personal experience, I did a lot of traveling, and I've ended up back in the area of England which I grew up in and where I truly feel my roots. And for me, my personal journey towards working with Polly Higgins and working on this law at the international level came directly from a deep internal commitment that I felt moving back to this countryside, to this landscape with my children, and feeling a deep internal commitment to that landscape and not knowing how that was going to materialize, but at the same time knowing that where I was going was going to be to do with my commitment to that land. And I really noticed that the way that people introduce themselves has, you know, both Leah and Robert introduced themselves in relation to the land that they're from and the people that they're from. And this is something that I believe that the Western approach lacks and that we could really learn from, because when you feel connected to a place, you care about that place. And so, you know, there's a kind of inbuilt connection that needs to be reestablished. And I believe, you know, in a certain way, to the Western mindset, and it may sound odd, but creating this crime has the potential to begin to nudge the mindset in that direction, because it does create that link between responsibility for the earth as well as responsibility for other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jojo, for that wonderful commentary. As we have about 4 minutes left, so I think that we have room for a lightning round on one audience question, perhaps. Anna?
Mm-hmm. Here it is. It comes from Chief Dry Yeast Territory in Treaty 8 in the Northwest Territories. There has been discussion of legislation around the rights of nature, but settler governments have sabotaged this discussion by pitting Indigenous rights against the rights of nature. So proposals on the rights of nature have been shelved. How does the crime against nature approach differ from the rights of nature approach? So how ecocide differs from the rights of nature?
Perhaps Jojo, lightning round?
Yeah, if I could come back on that one. So we see the relationship between ecocide crime and rights of nature as being rather similar to the relationship between murder and the right to life. Now, effectively, you can, you know, our primary right as a human right is the right to life. But unless we have a crime that prohibits damaging life, our right to life is of limited use. As you can imagine, if there were not a law, you know, a crime of murder, then your right to life might not be as frequently respected as it is. And indeed, historically, the crime of murder existed long before discussion of human rights. So there is a way in which criminal law can create protection, even if the rights themselves have not yet been established.
Great. I think that's because we want to leave enough time to wrap up here. Leah or Robert, do you have any quick closing remarks? Any burning thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I'll just say that I really do feel like we're at a critical juncture. You know, I certainly the work that's being done here is critical work, but I do have to say that you know, what I've been calling on a growing global corporate dictatorship that has more privileges than Mother Earth, than human beings, that this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed in terms of limiting the kind of destruction that is being perpetrated, certainly in Canada and around the world, primarily targeted at Indigenous folks, that laws are put in place to protect our earth and people. And I think we're running out of time. I think we're kind of beyond the point of intellectual discussion, and we need to act now before we see more damage to our waters and our mother.
We need to act now. Robert, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, just to address the point that Jojo raised. I've often said that, this Canada as a nation may not be killing our people in the street, but it doesn't mean our people are not dying in the street. And, the loss of traditional foods and the relegation to a very impoverished position in this country leads to many social challenges. And so, there is a proposal to create in our territory what they call a national marine conservation area, and in that process they did not consult Indigenous peoples as to the values that Indigenous peoples see as being important. So we are certainly very much in favor of preserving our territory, but it's for different reasons. Like we don't want a conservation area so that people can have a nice place to go and have a picnic. It is so that we can practice cultural traditions, including the gathering of foods that were important to our nations, important to maintaining our health, important to retaining our way of life and our connection to the earth. And so, those are some important issues to remember from an Indigenous perspective. Like we don't approach this from the same sort of mindset. I think we have different objectives, but they're very similar. They're similar to to say that we're conservationists. In some respects, we are, but we're conservationists for another purpose other than just to preserve. So yeah, I would think that's an important piece, and the destruction of the environment has a very significant effect on our communities. Thanks.
Well, with that, I'd like to, on behalf of Raven, express our gratitude to Jojo, Robert, and Leah for joining us today, and in fact, express our gratitude to all of our participants. Your engagement makes our work possible, and we really appreciate all of your questions, even though we had very limited time to address them. But of course, the conversation will continue. We have future webinars planned on this topic, and we look forward to those. Anna, would you like to provide just some details just before we close about that?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. So many people asked about the recording of this particular webinar. We will be sending out a link tomorrow in an email, and we'll also put in the registration for the next webinar on this topic, which will be on February 16th.
February 16th. Well, we look forward to seeing everyone then. And once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Good job, babe. We are still on stage, so to speak, but I don't want to leave without thanking you very much, Leah, pardon me, Jojo, for coming and for your very, very deep, incisive analysis. Really, really appreciate hearing from you. Are you going to be on the webinar on the 16th?
I'm not going to be there myself, but one of our team will be there. Louise Romain as our international grassroots outreach lead, will be speaking at the webinar on the 16th.
Okay. With some amazing Indigenous guests from this part of the world. That's great.
So thank you so much for having me on. It's been a fantastic webinar. Thank you. An amazing attendance.
Okay, well, we'll regroup. We'll send you obviously some follow-up emails, and we'll let you know how people are watching the videos and so on, just for your own records.
And there might be some questions we might make so bold as to ask you after the fact and put the answers in some blog or some kind of, because people often take it home and think about it and then send us questions the next day. So
that's absolutely fine. It would be a pleasure.
Very well. Thank you so much for carrying on this important work. Yes, take good care.
okay.
Night, night.
Right.